Aloha Com 110 class. This is a video just to set up this last reading that you'll do, Bridging Cultural Differences by President Eric Shumway. And I also wanted to make some references back to the piece that you had read by the De Hoyos on the universality of the gospel. So a few comments on both of these. You remember when we were reading back Milton Bennett's 6 stages of becoming interculturally sensitive? You might remember the first one was denial, and then defense, minimization. Those were the 3 stages of ethnocentrism: acceptance, adaptation, and integration. By the way, Caitlin was very, very complimentary on the essays that you wrote for that, and that's really good. It's really useful to just sort of step back away from ourselves, think about our lives, our histories, and these principles, and become kind of have a heightened awareness of our own ethnocentrism and our own kind of owning and our ownership of our lives and the cultural implications of them. So my hope all semester has been that the things that you are reading, thinking about, making videos about would create an opportunity for you to begin developing a new relationship, both with your own culture and your experience with cultural differences. I hope that's happening for you. But going back to Milton Bennett's model, there were those 3 stages, and then there were 3 stages of what he calls ethno-relativism, also called intercultural sensitivity, intercultural competence, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. In the minimization stage, Milton takes the position that any claim of universal truth is inherently ethnocentric. Now, he and I have argued late into the night on this question, and made quite a bit of effort to understand each other and think through our different positions, because mine was a position of faith and belief in God and my church. His position was one of no belief in either God or any church, and is often the case, very often the case, in the world of intercultural studies in universities. Most academics in this space not only don't believe in God and religion, but have considerable anxiety about religion and about God and the way it's been played out in historical terms in regards to ethnocentrism. That is, ethnocentric people who have a strong belief in God tend to impose their God on other people's God, and the long history of humankind is a lot of religious wars, and that's something they're very tuned into. And so religion, faith, belief is quite the problem in intercultural communication and literature. For those of us at places like BYU, it makes our relationship to the discipline a little bit awkward. Maybe awkward is not quite the right word. But obviously, when Milton Bennett makes his argument that someone who says we're all children of the same God, that is something I believe, but I don't believe it makes me ethnocentric. The value of someone like Milton Bennett and others is they have helped me to step back and think very carefully about the relationship between my belief, my faith, my claims of universal truth, and my determination not to be ethnocentric. So we, as we do in these GE classes, introductions to things like intercultural communication, we can barely just get an issue and a topic focused before it's time to move on to some other aspect of the study. But here at we end this semester thinking a lot or a little about the relationship between culture and the gospel. Let me just say a couple things about the De Hoyos real quick. In my own history of these issues, it became very important for me to discriminate my faith, my relationship to the church and to the gospel in these ways. One, I began to realize somewhere 30 years ago that the gospel was one thing. The gospel is universal, never changing. Its truths spread across all time and all space. Pure and undefiled truth is universal. Now that creates an interesting question. What pure and undefiled and absolute truths do we know that never change? Or said a different way, as the church becomes more international and encounters different cultural situations, what are the non-negotiables from the perspective of the prophet, first presidency, the Quorum of the 12? That is, a lot of things can change as the church moves from one area to another area because it encounters one culture and then another, and there's adaptation along the way. But what never changes? What is non-negotiable? Which is a way of saying what is pure, absolute, universal truth that's in the gospel. And it's a good question for all of us to ask and to think about. Second was my relationship to the church. Now the church is more local to time and place and space. What I mean is the church does change. Policies, processes, procedures, programs, culture of the church changes. We might think about Joseph Smith, and if he had been born as a Tongan in 1806, whatever year he was born, and the church had grown up and been grown up in the surround of Tongan culture, how different would the church be? Well, it'd probably be different. If Joseph Smith had been a Chinese boy who grew up 50 miles outside of Beijing in 1806, the church would have been different, but the gospel would not have been different. So I think about the church, I think about the gospel. I can bear my testimony of the gospel and say, I know it is true. I can bear my testimony of the church too and say, I know it is true. But when I bear my testimony of the church and say, I know it's true, I'm bearing my testimony of the restoration of the gospel and the priesthood and prophets and apostles and on the earth, and the priesthood on the earth and exercised by priesthood authorities, bishops, stake presidents, quorum, priesthood quorums. I can bear my testimony that the church is God's, but it is not the same as the gospel. I guess we know that just by observation. We think about the gospel functioning with the Nephites in 4th Nephi and the creation of Zion there. They probably didn't have anything that looked like our church exactly. Primary, home teaching, relief site visiting teaching. Form changes. The substance does not. But then there's the third thing that I began to be conscious of, and that's what I would just call popular Mormon culture. Popular Mormon culture is embodied in, it's not an expression of the church so much, it's not an expression of the gospel, it's an expression just of people who are Mormons. And maybe it's manifest in the music, LDS teenage literature, firesides that kind of go on, some LDS plays, LDS businessmen associations. There's lots of ways in which there's this other entity. And I would never say I have a testimony of LDS popular culture. The truth is, I have some anxieties about various aspects of LDS popular culture. And I get a little bit concerned that people confuse the culture of Mormondom and the gospel, but I don't get too concerned. The gospel is restored to the earth, the pure and undefiled truths. The church is true. And then there's us living our lives within the context of. Okay. So the De Hoyos write their article about ideas of universality. I certainly would not agree with a lot of what they implied or premises that they were basing some of their work on. We're not going to have time to talk about all of that. I do certainly agree with some of it, and less so with others of it. Now let's talk just about President Shumway's article. I want you to read his article with the idea of Bennett's minimization in mind. Think about how President Shumway is approaching cultural difference and an openness to it, and how he's positioning it as a universal, an important element of intercultural communication, resolving cultural differences, bridging, and the way that he uses the gospel to bridge, create people of one heart and of one mind in the context of diversity and harmony in that diversity. Pay really close attention to his embracing, accepting, adapting, integrating cultural differences. He himself has the title of a Tongan talking chief, a very high title in Tongan culture, in the country of Tonga, and is one of probably the world non-native Tongan speaker, leading expert on the Tongan language. So pay really close attention to that. Make your video explaining the argument that President Shumway makes, the examples that he uses to demonstrate how to appropriately embrace cultural difference while simultaneously holding on to universal gospel truths. That's your assignment, and now you're going to have one other assignment that has to do with the final paper that you're going to write for this class, but I'll make another video here in just a few minutes to explain that.